The following is a Hoop Ball presentation. Welcome to the Fantasy NBA Today podcast.
I got bad news, friends. I got about 10 minutes into a show with our good buddy Neil Rochlani and his internet cut out, never to be heard from again. The poor lad is getting yanked around by the not-so-good people of Comcast USA, who I have to believe is in the running for worst companies ever. I feel extremely fortunate that I am stuck with the second worst company ever, and that's, who handles our, is it Spectrum now in Southern California? It used to be Time Warner, and it was Adelphia before that. You know, the telecom providers of this universe are really pressed to be worse than they are. So, bad news on that for everybody. You're stuck with Dan solo on today's pod. I am Dan Besbris. This is Fantasy NBA Today, a hoop ball presentation. Hopefully, Neil can get that situation rectified. He should be on the Friday show with our buddy Adrian Benjamins as well, but you guys know how that internet stuff goes. Remember those shows midway through last season where, God, how did I end up doing those? I did one like first thing in the morning when the internet came back for 15 minutes, and it was the shortest show ever. And then when I called, I got some weird automated message that told me that a squirrel had chewed through cabling somewhere. I mean, this was like, you can't make this stuff up. Anyway, as they say, we are a little more than halfway through what's been a pretty fun week in fantasy NBA circles. We spent the entire show yesterday breaking down the Kawhi Leonard trade, but the one angle that we didn't cover, and that's what we're going to spend some time on today's Thursday edition, is the injury aspect. And not just of the Kawhi Leonard trade, but also what that means from a fantasy standpoint in terms of where you're going to be targeting these guys. Draft position, expectations, what is an injury-prone basketball player? It's such a hotly debated topic, and people are so quick to throw guys off their radar. And I want to, if possible, really try to home in on what the solution is to that problem, and it's a big one. You can follow me on Twitter at Dan Besbris. You can follow Hoopball at HoopBallFantasy or go to hoop-ball.com. It's almost that time, guys. We're, as we've said earlier this week and last week, we're really just like a month away from where things start to slowly ramp their way up. But Summer League is over. It would have been low tide if not for a Kawhi Leonard trade. And we've got tenets to cover. We've got foundational stuff that I want to build on. For those of you that didn't listen to yesterday's podcast, the gist of it was Kawhi Leonard was traded. And you've probably heard that already. But Kawhi Leonard was traded from the San Antonio Spurs to the Toronto Raptors. In exchange, the Spurs received DeMar DeRozan, Jakob Poeltl, and a protected first-round pick that if it doesn't pan out, then it turns into 2 second-round picks or something like that. It's really not much when you think about the fact that it seemed like the Spurs were getting ready to go young. But instead, they went a different route, most likely because they weren't getting enough of the young, up-and-coming superstars that they were looking for. And it's tough to get when you're trading a guy who refuses to play and when your leverage, which was basically LeBron James, pre-free agency, has been sharp enough to say, I'm not going to make the team that I'm going to dispatch of all of their awesome young basketball players, regardless of who that was. Philly, Lakers, whatever. So that trade went down. I talked on yesterday's podcast about what it means for the teams from a win-loss perspective. We got into the fantasy ramifications of some of the other guys on the two teams, the individual players themselves, and what that meant. I'm not going to repeat all that stuff. If you want that, it was a half-an-hour show, so it wasn't super long, but you can go back and you can listen to the Wednesday edition of this podcast. Breaks it all down in spades. Where I want to pick up for today's podcast is Kawhi Leonard himself. Because we kind of did an arrow up, arrow down kind of thing on yesterday's show. DeMar DeRozan, arrow down. LaMarcus Aldridge, arrow down. Rudy Gay, arrow down. Jakob Poeltl, meh, either way. Kyle Lowry, no change. Jonas Valanciunas, probably some room for improvement with Pirtle out of town, which happens often, right? You know, the Raptors sent more minutes and shot attempts one way than what they got back. Easy enough. Simple math. Kawhi Leonard is the one we didn't get into a ton on yesterday's podcast, which seems odd considering he is the best player involved in that blockbuster trade. But we didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about what he can do on a basketball court. So let's do that today. And we're going to use that to segue into a discussion about injury and what that means from a fantasy perspective. 2 seasons back, when Kawhi Leonard played 74 games, and mind you, he always has had some durability issues, although 74 games is pretty workable. 2 seasons ago, Kawhi Leonard averaged 25.5 points per game on 48.5% shooting from the field, 2 3-pointers a night, 88% at the free throw line on 7+ attempts per game, 6 rebounds, 3.5 assists, 1.8 steals, and 0.7 blocks per game. So this is a dude that's regularly in the 2.5 to 3 steals and blocks together range. He is fantastic at percentages. He's a 3-point shooter. He scores. He rebounds. He assists enough. He is a guy that, and I think I'm betting, at least, a lot of people have forgotten, was basically a top 5 fantasy basketball player because he was good at everything. He was a positive impact fantasy player out of 9 statistical categories: field goal percent, free throw percent, 3-pointers, points, assists, and steals. That's 6 out of the 9. And he was basically break even in rebounds and blocks and ever so slightly sub-average in turnovers, which is absurd when you think about how many times most first-round guys turn the ball over. He was at 2.1 turnovers per game 2 seasons back. The only other guys that were in that wheelhouse for first-rounders this year, Karl-Anthony Towns was 1.9. Jimmy Butler, if you want to throw him into that mix, was a very good 1.8. And Anthony Davis was at 2.2. Pretty remarkable stuff that Kawhi Leonard did all of that with only 2.1 turnovers per game. He was the number 4 player in fantasy. Don't forget that. Behind Kevin Durant, Anthony Davis, and Steph Curry. He was better than Giannis Antetokounmpo 2 years ago. Better than Karl-Anthony Towns on a per-game basis. Better than James Harden, Chris Paul, Russell Westbrook. All of those guys Kawhi Leonard was leaving in his wake. Of course, there wasn't a whole lot of room for him to go up from that particular statistical standpoint, right? Looking at his career numbers, it was his second best shooting season to the crazy... well, you know what? If you go all the way back to when he was taking fewer than 10 shots a game, he did have a 52% year. But with all the 3-pointers creeping into his game, you had to figure it would take some kind of an impact. It was, by the way, a much worse 3-point shooting season than the previous year. So I guess you could argue he could be even better from the field than 48.5%. He's a career 49.5%er. But all of the other stuff was basically as good as it was going to get. He's a 6 to 7 rebound kind of guy. The assists were a career high. Averaging 2 or more steals per game is very difficult when you're shouldering a lot of the offensive burden. 0.7 is actually right on his career number in blocks. Turnovers was a career high at 2.1, so I guess you could say maybe that comes down. In any event, you're looking at a guy who will probably never be the number 1 fantasy basketball player, but when he's right, he's top 7. Easy. He's an easy top 7. But of course, that's a big if. What do we know about him? Nothing. We know nothing. He played in 9 games this year, Averaged 16 points, about 5 rebounds, 2 assists, 2 steals, and a block per game on 47% shooting, 1.2 3-pointers, 82% at the free throw line, which, by the way, still pretty good. That was top 30, playing only 23 and a half minutes per game coming off of whatever this injury was. So playing at way less than 100% and far fewer minutes, like a third, meaning you could bump all of his numbers by about 50% and you get him more to the pace. He played 33 and a half minutes per game the previous season. He played under 24 minutes per game this last year. Right, he's not going to average 3 steals and 1.5 blocks per game. There are certain things that you can do in short bursts that you can't sustain when you're on the floor for a longer period. But he was basically right where he was the year before. If you extrapolate that 23 to a 33, then you're talking about another 7 or 8 points. So that gets him up to about 23, slightly down from the previous year. He would actually be out rebounding the previous season, back up near 7, which he has done twice. The assists very close to the previous year. Free throws were down. A lot of that stuff was kind of shaking the rust off. So even a kind of a bad Kawhi Leonard, and this surprised the hell out of me, and I know we're really getting into the weeds on this one, and I'm earning that pedantic nickname again, is, GMs have said that they're worried that maybe he's more of a top 15 guy if he's not at 100%. Kawhi at less than 100%, even this most recent year, from a fantasy perspective, still had the per 36 numbers of a top 7 fantasy guy. Those didn't go away. He just wasn't playing the minutes, and he wasn't unrusted. He wasn't rustoliumed yet. So that boggles the mind. Here's what we have to go on in mid-July. The Raptors made the trade. So they believe that he is mostly healthy. You're not swinging for the fences like this if you don't think the guy's going to play for you. And by the way, I really don't think he's going to sit out. I don't think he's going to sit out. He's going to play. He's out of San Antonio. He has an opportunity to sort of show everybody how good he is, build his super team, whatever he wants to do, whether it's in Los Angeles or elsewhere. I think he's going to play. And Toronto's a good spot. They've got a good culture. Kyle Lowry's a likable dude, and they're good, and so on and so forth. So I think he's going to play. To me, a worst-case scenario is injury-related for Kawhi Leonard because I don't worry about his stats. If he's in there, he's going to be putting up juicy fantasy lines. I do worry about his health. Is this a thing that could come back easily? Is it ever really fully gone? Forget come back. Is he just going to have to play through it the rest of his career? Is it going to cause him to miss 15 to 20 games just for maintenance? These are big deals from a team that is going to want to have him healthy come playoff time. So there's no impetus to run him out there for 80 games this year, and I think you're really betting incorrectly. You're playing a bad hand if you're picking up Kawhi Leonard and expecting 75 games or more. If for no other reason, then he's never played 75 games in a season. But, and we've talked about this before, going back to the year when Kawhi Leonard was the number 4 guy by average, in 74 games, he was still top 7. He fell behind Westbrook, Harden, Giannis, and Kat. Kevin Durant fell a little bit farther than Kawhi did. But think about that. He was still right there with these guys, even though they played 10% more games. It kind of takes you to the Chris Paul story, where he's been playing 60-some-odd games year after year lately. He's not staying on the floor. He played 58 games this year. He played 61 games the season before that. Chris Paul was a top 10 guy on a per-game basis. He was a top 25 guy, missing a third of the season. Almost. Okay, fine. I rounded up a little bit. More like 30%. Make of that what you will. Me rounding. But that's pretty impressive. Chris Paul played 58 games this year, and he was number 22 in 9-cat formats. And I know a lot of other second-round guys had worse seasons, which cleared the path for him to be number 22 instead of, 27. But you can't really use that because there's always going to be some kind of weird factor playing out. Kawhi Leonard has that ability and then some. If he plays 58 games this year, he could still be a top 25 guy. If he plays 65 games, he's in the teens. And if he plays 70 games or more, he's a top 10 fantasy player. So that's your bet right now with Kawhi Leonard. How many games are you going to get out of him? Because the numbers are going to be there. I don't think he falls to number 20. I think people remember how good he is. But, man, and this year I didn't want to draft him at all because we heard he was still injured. But if we go into this season and we hear that Kawhi is playing on opening night, hell yeah, I'd draft him. Hell yeah, I'd draft him. What if you could get Kawhi Leonard in the second round and he plays 65 or 70 games? That's beautiful. What if he plays more than that? Crazy stuff. So I'm on board. But what does this mean overall from an injured player standpoint? What guys am I personally willing to take chances on like this? Why am I willing to take a chance on Kawhi Leonard but not someone else? It's sort of a two-pronged reasoning. I need a player who I believe can play X number of games, some number that I'm looking for, to get him to a particular value point. And I need a player who's undervalued because of the injury standpoint. Anthony Davis. Every year. The injury tag. Perpetually undervalued. Perpetually undervalued. He was the runaway number one player in fantasy. There was not anybody remotely close to him in 9-cat format. No matter, you look at totals, you look at per game, he is blowing everyone out of the water. He's 30% more important than the number 2 fantasy player. And yet, he's far from the consensus number 1 going into next season. The previous year, Anthony Davis tied for first overall on totals with Steph and Kat, who each, by the way, played more games than AD that year, and sitting just behind Kevin Durant on a per-game basis. But, of course, KD missed 20 games. We don't know that he would have kept up that pace for the remaining 20 games. Anthony Davis has been either number 1 by himself or tied for number 1 each of the last 2 seasons. And I really feel like I'm on an island saying I'm drafting him first no matter what, because everybody's afraid of the injury stuff. And yes, I'll give you this. It's heart-stopping thing. He goes to the locker room more than anybody else in the NBA, but he often comes back out. And he's usually, halfway through the third quarter when it happens anyway. There are going to be those nights where you watch your fantasy season flash before your eyes. But boy, when you look back at this year, if you had the opportunity to get Anthony Davis at any point in the middle, late parts of the first round, you basically won your league. Because he is like having Steph Curry and Otto Porter together. He is like having James Harden and Kristaps Porzingis before he got hurt. Can you believe? Think of the names that I'm rattling off right now. He's like having Kyrie Irving and LeBron James together. And I'm not saying, you have Anthony Davis in the first round and somebody else in the second round. I'm saying Anthony Davis is worth LeBron James and Kyrie Irving in a trade. And you'd get your own second round pick. Mind-boggling how important he was. Who are some of the other guys this year that got dinged up, that dropped off the map? Besides Not Anthony Davis, because he only missed 7 games this season. But besides Kawhi Leonard, Steph Curry missed 31 games this year. Hell yeah, I'm all aboard the Steph train. He's another guy that I believe is going to fall in that first round because of injury stuff. Here's an interesting note. Kevin Durant. I'm actually kind of off the Kevin Durant freight train. Why, Dan, are you drawing these distinctions like this? Well, it comes down to games played and track record. Also, the Warriors are just going to be totally gassed, and probably the only guy on the Warriors that's not totally gassed is Steph Curry. Kevin Durant has played 72, 62, and 68 games the last 3 seasons. He played 27 games the year before that in Oklahoma City, and it's been since 2013-14 that he's cleared 80 games or played what you'd even consider to be a mostly full season. Just that 72-gamer in there over the last 4 years has been a full campaign. So I think with Durant, if you're taking him top 3 or 4, you have to realize that there's going to be 10 to 15 missed games in there. Steph Curry is kind of the opposite side. Remember, he went through some issues early in his career that cost him the better part of the 2011-2012 NBA season. But other than that, and this most recent year, he's actually been crazy durable. Dude gets a really bad rap for those ankles, but he had played 78, 78, 80, 79, and 79 games 5 years running before this anomaly of a 51-game season, which would have, by the way, been more like 62 or 63 if JaVale McGee doesn't bash him in the knee. Remember, that was part of it as well. So the ankles, yes, they were a problem, but if you're getting 63 games out of Steph Curry, you're still talking about a top 15 guy. Which I realize sounds crazy, but that's how good those top few dudes actually are. 51 games out of Steph Curry, he was still inside the top 20. Fathom that for a moment. A dude who actually has built a track record of being very durable lately has this weird injury-prone tag on him because of one bad season, and now it creeps back up again and creates a mega load of value. Whereas Kevin Durant, it's almost like people don't care that he misses 14 games every year. What about the guys, well, we talked about Chris Paul just a moment ago. He's another dude that very clearly cannot go the full 82 anymore. And the Rockets don't need him to. Chris Paul now has played 74, 61, and 58 the last 3 seasons, steadily moving down. And if you look over his last, I think it's 7 full seasons, basically since he went to the Clippers, 60, 70, 62, 82, he went all 82, one season in there, 74, 61, and 58. Chris Paul has been way less durable than people realize. It was early in his career when he was playing most of the games every year. It's been a long time. It's been like since his 27th birthday that he really just hasn't been able to stay around for a full season. And I know that his value is going to take a big hit because he's coming off of 2 severely injury-prone campaigns, but I am truly worried that he will be in another. I guess you always ask yourself, well, how injury-prone, right? Because we just said even in 58 games, he was still the number 22 9-category fantasy asset, so you could have taken him near the end of the second round, and you would have had a value. And even if you took him at like 15, it's not that bad to get the number 22 guy with your number 15 pick. It's not what you want, but it could be a lot worse. I guess to that end, we'll see where he pre-ranks, but if people are taking him around the turn, that to me is too early for a guy who gets beat up like Paul. If he's falling to the end of the second round, then he's a massive steal. Just that number of picks, just a few picks like that mean an awful lot. Jimmy Butler. Terrified of Jimmy Butler. I am terrified of Jimmy Butler. These are guys, and I hope you guys are starting to see the distinction in how I'm grading these guys out. Jimmy Butler has not played 82 games, but for one of his 7 NBA seasons. By the way, he's not that old yet. He's not yet 30. He's not even 29. And he was drafted in 2011, so he hasn't been around as long as some of these other guys, but he's just been, oh my God, the poor dude. He played 39 minutes a game for 2 seasons in a row, 37, 37, 37. Tom Thibodeau can really grind a career to a halt, and Jimmy Butler looks like that kind of victim. So he ain't playing a whole season. No chance. None. Something will knock him out. And then you've got the guys coming back off of significant injuries. Boogie Cousins, not interested. Kristaps Porzingis, not that interested. These guys have big names, and they're still going to go too early. And I find that stashing someone, using up a roster slot like that, is really only worthwhile in keeper formats where you can... anything you get out of that player for this coming season is gravy. The real reason you're picking them or drafting them wherever it is because you're planning on keeping them at some kind of discount for the following year. So like I'm in a keeper league, I would consider drafting Boogie Cousins in like the 6th or 7th round and just bench him for the entire campaign so that I can spend a 4th or 5th round pick to keep a guy who can give me turn value the following year. I mean, that's looking way down the line. Porzingis, same kind of thing, add around or whatever. Coming back from these injuries is hard. Shot blockers like Porzingis, that's going to be tough as well. I think he'll have a more productive season than Boogie, but by no means is this going to be a simple campaign. Each player is his own case. That's probably your topic sentence, and that's probably what we should have led with. Each player is its own case. You weigh the facts. You look at career numbers, career arc, how many games they've played over a certain set number of recent seasons over their entire year, and you come up with a plan. For instance, ladies and gentlemen, Anthony Davis, looping it all the way around, full circle now. The first 4 years of AD's NBA career, he went 60, 66, 68, and 61 games. That's bad. He did develop the injury-prone tag, but we found out last year, 16-17 season, that they were basically keeping him out of half of those things because they were just kid-gloving him. They weren't going to make a run into the postseason, so why the hell push it? Last year, New Orleans decided they wanted to try to make a push. It's time to start trying to win for real. And this year, they definitely wanted to win their games, and so he played 75 games each of the last 2 seasons and just dominated. He's totally changed the narrative on himself, and he's given us the confidence to say a lot of those little nagging injuries he would play through if the games mattered. Now that we see that they do, he's playing. Whereas a guy like Kevin Durant, you could argue both sides. The games don't really matter because the Warriors are making the top 2 seed with or without him. And he is often pretty banged up, and they're usually not the greatest. For me, a lot of the Warriors get a bit of a demerit. Draymond Green coming off a pretty beat-up campaign. Kevin Durant beat up every year. Like I said, I like Steph Curry because I think he's going to fall in the first round, and I think, if you call this season the anomaly, you bet on a bounce back, you could get the number 2 fantasy guy at probably like 6 or 7. It's a big get in the first round. And then Klay Thompson, who's always the same. He was actually a little bit worse this year, oddly enough. But 20 points, 4 boards, 2.5 assists, blah, blah, blah. And he missed 9 games, which is weird because, he doesn't miss games. But half of the Warriors, to me, are sort of on the outs. What I'd like to do here as we approach the end of the podcast is kind of put the ball back into your court. I'd like to start a Twitter dialogue. I might even do likewise in the Hoopball forums. Maybe I'll save that until we get a little bit closer to the actual start of the NBA campaign. But let's talk about injured players. Who's in, who's out, and why. We can make pretty good arguments about every stinking one of them. And I'm talking about guys that have either been labeled injury-prone over the last 5 years or missed 10 to 15 games or more this season. I'm not talking about guys that missed like 5 or 6 games. That's just always going to happen. It's a long year. Guys get dinged up. But all the other guys that we talked about, and then 15, 20 more players out there that just Kevin Love misses a lot of games. Nik Vucevic missed a bunch of time. Rudy Gobert has missed some time. Joel Embiid is an injury state. Gary Harris is an under-the-radar, always injured dude. Niko Mirotic got punched in the face. Tyreek Evans, Devin Booker. There's so many names out there. Blake Griffin, John Wall, Aaron Gordon. Let's make arguments about every single one of these dudes. I think this is going to be a really good way to kind of strategize and plan our way towards fantasy mock draft season. All right, friends, that'll about do it for us on this Thursday episode. Again, Adrian and Neil will have you tomorrow to wrap up the week, and then we'll circle around and start again on Monday. I am Dan Besbris. This is Fantasy NBA Today. Please hit me up on Twitter if you have questions or if you want to start the injury dialogue already. If not, I'll try to get something going myself. Rate and review the podcast if you haven't already. I'm guessing a few of you are new listeners here as we enter the upswing of the off season. iTunes is the one that means the most to us. And subscribe. Oh, yes, subscribe to the podcast. That's actually a really big deal if you haven't already. I am at Dan Besbris on Twitter. We are at Hoopball Fantasy. You can send the note at any of us. You can just reply to the tweet that we put out that contains the link to this podcast. I will see that too. Have a wonderful Thursday. And since I'm not going to talk to you tomorrow, have a great weekend, a great Friday. Dan, will talk to you on Monday. Fantasy NBA Today, back at you tomorrow. So long, everybody.
This has been a Hoop Ball presentation.